make it as exciting and relevant as possible. So yeah, I'm going to be sharing a presentation throughout, but try and make sure that I'm also in focus, that you can see me as we talk through a lot of the items that we're dealing with. In particular, I have posted on the chat for each of you to go and download the chart of motions. It's quite an important document. If you can see it on the chat there, try and log in. If you have any problems with accessing it, let me know. But the idea is that this chart of motions, and which I'm holding up here, is really what we're going to be going through and identifying the different types of motions that happen in a parliamentary meeting or any kind of deliberative council, and what that means for us, and how we deal with those motions, particularly if you're chairing, but also if you're participating, how can you frame your question or your amendment or whatever it is that you're trying to get the council to appreciate. How do you frame it in the best way possible? So it's quite important to understand these motions, but so just try and download that if you can, and then we can use that as we progress. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, and now I get a screen share failure. That's difficult. Okay, so it looks like. Can you see my screen at all? Zoom has decided to fail on me.
No.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Now.
Yeah.
If you want, you can email me your presentation and I can present for you if we have.
Yeah, let me do that. That is very interesting. I've never had that from Zoom before. Okay, I will talk to that if you can then show it, and then we can go through it as if is that okay with you, Anka?
Yeah, perfect. On my
Cool,
Gmail,
thank you.
if you could just pop it through to there, I'll pick it up.
I'm just sending it now.
In the meantime, welcome to all the presidents, VPEs, all executive committee members from Mauritius, Angola, and Madagascar who are joining us. Particularly, I know you've been very much interested in this session, and we look forward to hosting you at the council meeting happening next Saturday, same time on the 18th of September. And that is why it's particularly at this session. Bowen, the Toastmaster, is our parliamentarian in District 24, and hence he is running the session. So he's just going to make sure that your voice is heard. And welcome again to District 24. Looking forward to contributions next Saturday.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm just going to proceed regardless. I don't particularly need the PowerPoint right now, so we can at least get started. So the big thing for why we do parliamentary procedure and the way in which we see it is that it's really about providing a mechanism, a custom that we can all use in the deliberation. And it tries to set up a set of rules which guide us into how we can deal with specific items and get them and debate them and get them sort of off the table in a way that everyone feels comfortable with the decision that is made. It really is about justice and courtesy to all. So it may seem pretty dry and problematic and trying to follow all these different processes, but it does try to make sure that everybody can actually participate in the process at the same time and with the same level of comfort that your voice is heard. And a key component of parliamentary procedure is that the majority rules. You know, whenever the decisions are made, it is going to be the majority that decides the outcome. But that doesn't mean that it's majority dictatorship, that it's the majority gets to silence everybody. The minority must always be heard, and the minority has a right of participation. Even if they don't agree with the final outcome, they would feel more comfortable that the voice was heard and what they were wanting to say has been kind of adopted by everybody. So that's really one important or two important aspects, that the decisions are dictated by the majority in the end, but that everyone gets a chance to participate and their voices are heard. Another key thing is trying to process one thing at a time. And it's quite important because often when we're debating a lot of these issues, people have amendments coming in from the side, and then you kind of want people who want to postpone the meeting, or you want to do to kind of change the course in which the discussion is being held, and you want to suspend the rules, or various things happening, we try and create this chart of motions. Really gives us a way to say what takes precedence, what works at some point and doesn't work at others. Where do you stop? And it's really important for the chair to be listening to what people are saying and affording everyone the opportunity, but also saying, hang on, we can't discuss that now because we're busy with this. We'll come to that. And so that's quite an important thing. And so the idea as a parliamentary procedure is not to try and bog us down in really complicated, almost arcane sets of rules. It's to actually try and facilitate that we can get through the business that needs to be done efficiently. A lot of what we use in Toastmasters International, and it's used predominantly in America and large numbers of places sort of in the sort of Western Hemisphere, is Robert's Rules of Order. And Robert's Rules of Order is quite a comprehensive book. I don't have it on me to show you, but it's quite a comprehensive book that kind of shows what happens at different points in a discussion. And there's chapters and chapters about how you run elections, what happens with candidates and what happens with the results of the votes and that sort of thing. We're not going to cover elections. Elections has an entire interesting set of things on their own as to what counts as a victory, how do you deal with spoiled ballots, etc., etc. We're not really going to that space. We're dealing now with trying to reach a decision by a committee. And so Roberts, what he did, and this was actually done in the 1870s, he kind of went to different parts of the US and noticed that at meetings, people had kind of different ways of doing things, different protocols, different customs. And he said, well, how do I put this into some sort of standardized format, which would help people who are struggling with some of these issues? So he created this standard book, this book of rules, and it's kind of gone now into I think the 11th edition, might even be the 12th now, which kind of gets updated as things change and as we kind of discover different ways of doing that. So it's quite important for us to acknowledge that it is an incredible resource, and particularly in Toastmasters, we use it as the guide. So we often have if you look at our district standard order, when it comes to anything that happens at the council meeting, we have obviously, firstly, it's the Toastmasters governing documents, including the district bylaws. So there are specific bylaws that apply to district administrative laws. Then we have our kind of standard rules that we call our code of practice. And those kind of then have a set of precedents. And then we also would include the Robert's Rules of Order that covers all the things that we haven't already established in terms of that standard order. So it's quite important that we acknowledge that Roberts gives the guidance as to how we do things, but we also have to bear in mind that there are other standing rules and things that take precedence. So when we talk about a motion, so everything we're going to talk about today is how we handle a motion that comes up at a council meeting, at a club meeting, when you have a business session. How do you handle the motions and what do we do with it? So the first thing to note about motions is that the chair acknowledges a member who is important. The chair will say, I acknowledge you, so-and-so, Joe, so to come and present this motion. And the person will say, I move such, and we'll talk about what it is that they're actually moving in terms of the motion. And then you go on to a set of things that we'll do. I want to first discuss what makes a good or a bad motion. Often people put too much information into a motion. Okay, a motion can be pretty simple. District must buy a printer. That's a motion. But often someone will put in, well, we've discovered that there's a lot of issues with some of the district printing in the last 10 years. Every time we have a committee meeting or a council meeting, the printer never seems to function, blah, blah, blah. You don't need that information. That's motivation. And the motivation is important, but it doesn't form part of the motion. The whys and wherefores are what we'll debate as part of the debate in terms of motivating for a result. But the actual thing, district must buy a printer, is the crucial component. So it's quite important for us to consider that when we write motions, it must be specific. It must be able to provide guidance to the council, the committee, and try and avoid dealing with a lot of additional material. So one of the things as well is also motions cannot be passed that actually contravene the mandate of the committee. So if we think about the district, and for districts in particular, one of the ones that is in my presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to get that up relatively soon, is district must reduce semi-annual dues. You know,
sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
But I do have the presentation ready if you'd like me to start sharing.
Yeah, please go ahead, and I'll direct you.
Okay, perfect, I'll do that.
Cool, thanks. And yeah, and if you, if everybody could also just make sure that they can see me at the same time as the presentation, that would also be good. So you can do side-by-side speaker as we talk through it. Thanks. So if you can cut to go to slide number 3, I think it is. Yeah, and the next slide. Cool. So here we're talking about motions. So as I was mentioning, someone says district must reduce semi-annual dues to $18, and that's our motion. But actually, it's an invalid motion. You could debate the cost of semi-annual dues, but district can't actually do anything about semi-annual dues. Potentially, you could say district must approach Toastmasters International to reduce semi-annual dues, or make a motion to the board of directors. But on its own, district does not have the mandate. And then, as I was sort of talking about earlier, when we now have a motion that says the sound quality of the past few district contests have been terrible, so district should get new sound equipment. My cousin John runs a sound shop and can get us a good deal. That is just a bad motion on so many levels. But firstly, you don't need the motivation. We don't need to talk about the sound quality of the past few meetings. The gist is district should get new sound equipment, or district shall procure sound equipment. And we definitely don't need to know about John running a sound shop, because ethical violations should not be part of council meetings. So it's quite important that how you frame the motion is also an important thing. I know most of us would say, well, we just want this to happen. There's a certain art to kind of like, how do I word it such a way that it has a better chance of succeeding? Okay, great. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Anka. So now, once a motion has been tabled, so the member has stood up and said, my name is so-and-so, and I move that, and gives the motion. The second thing that must happen is that the chair has to see if there's another member that is willing to second that motion. Now, seconding is an important thing, because it's basically someone else on the committee or in the assembly is saying, yeah, that's an important consideration, and I want to discuss that. If nobody seconds that, if there is no second for that motion, it fails, it falls away. There is no debate, there is no discussion. It's one person having a little thing that they want to talk about and nobody else cares. It just disappears. And I know it's quite important, because we have had it previously where there has been a motion, and when you ask for a seconder, nobody puts their arm up. It's basically saying it's a one-man issue or one-person issue that nobody really wants to discuss. And so it kind of doesn't happen. So it needs to be seconded. There is often a kind of a sense that the seconder has to be someone that agrees with the motion. It's generally considered that that's kind of normal, but it doesn't have to be. The person who seconds the motion might actually kind of be ambivalent, or might even be against it, but they want it to be discussed because it's something that needs to be resolved. And I've been trying to think of a good example, but let's go back to our thing about the sound equipment. Someone wants us to buy the sound equipment. Somebody else wants us to let's just discuss it and get it off the table, because we just don't have the money, but we need to keep shutting down this debate because it keeps coming up. And it's just something to kind of clear the air, to kind of have it out there discussed and resolved one way or the other. So seconding is important. Something that doesn't, if you look at the way the rules are written, the seconder also doesn't have to be sort of acknowledged. You just say, I'm looking for a seconder, anyone can raise their hand, and that's done. There's no discussion, now it's tabled. The chair then repeats the motion. So placing it before the group, said the motion is X. That's now for us to discuss, and then opens the debate. generally it starts with the person who proposed would have an opportunity to speak, and then against and for, against, for, against, for, and you kind of work through all the discussion in that way. Once the debate is exhausted, you then can put it to the vote, and then the chair announces the result. In district, we have a sort of tradition, and it's I think it's written in our code of practice. I was trying to look it up this morning, is that normally the seconder also gets an opportunity to speak. But if you look at any of the Roberts rules, that's not a requirement. It's just something we do. So generally, it should be the person that proposes, then you start going against, for, against, for. And we also have a tendency for the person that proposed it to be able to wrap up the debate at the end. Again, it's not in Roberts, it's just something we do. So sometimes the customs are there and they're allowed, but it's not a requirement as far as Roberts is concerned. And then once the debate is completed, you would then kind of put the vote, and how you put the vote is also quite important. Often, if we're in person, it's just a voice vote. All those in favor say aye, all those against say nay, and you can sort of sense who's carrying. But it's also, it can be such a point that you actually can't tell. And then it goes to a hand vote, or if necessary, a secret ballot. Sometimes you can actually have, and we'll get there to a point where someone disagrees. Say the chair is listening and it says, oh, it sounds like the ayes have it. Someone could say, no, I call a division. And a division means that you actually now have to do the hand vote or secret ballot as required. But generally a hand vote, so that you can actually count up the number of votes, and it's not just a sense of the room. And ordinarily that's good practice as well, because sometimes, some of us get louder than others. You can always get that the sense of the sound is not necessarily a good indication of what the feeling of the room is. So if it's close, or someone feels that they need to have this recorded as a yes or a no, and the numbers, someone can call that and require it in terms of the vote. But once the result is announced, that's done and dusted. The debate is closed. There is no ability to go and discuss this again. Okay. I'm trying to see if I can see hands and stuff. If anyone has any questions, please interrupt me. I'm quite happy to have a discussion on this as we go through, because it's meant to be sort of an interaction session. So yeah, if we can then, yeah, Lynette, please go for it. Lynette, I see your hand is up.
Go ahead and try again. I've made it so you can unmute yourself.
Oh.
Thank you so much. Keith, I just have a question regarding a voice vote in a virtual meeting. Would that be practical? And
Yeah, no,
for a hand vote, because I'm not sure that anybody would really be able to see whether that would be practical or not.
Yeah, look, online things get really interesting and complicated. I still think if you've got a fair handle on who's in the room from a perspective of members versus non-members, people with votes versus people without votes, you can actually just do a quick poll. And if the difference is more than 30 or 40%, you can accept that, because obviously in a poll, there are going to be people who shouldn't be voting because you haven't done the credentials for the polling process. But if it's the vast majority are members, doing a quick poll can give you a sense that the majority is in one way or another. If it's like 90 votes for and 5 against, who's going to split hairs on that? That's as good as a voice vote. But if someone says, no, I now want a actual vote, a show of hands, then you need to have a proper voting kind of system. And that's where ideally you could have it such that the poll is only for members. And I know you can't normally do that, but otherwise you can do a mechanism where you kind of have like election buddy or one of those things where it actually goes to a proper vote, and only the people who have votes, who are registered, get to actually vote on that particular issue. So ordinarily you can deal with most things through a simple poll, and you can see the difference, but otherwise you would actually have to go to something a little bit more rigorous. I know in some of the districts, because luckily I've been asked to be involved in some parliamentary and in some of the districts, what they do is that the people in the Zoom room are only members. Observers log in on Facebook or something. So you have a little bit more control. But even then, we've actually had problems where doing the Zoom poll for the people in the room has failed. Not everybody got the poll, which is, how on earth does that happen? But Zoom fails, as we found this morning. Things sometimes go wrong. Otherwise, you would have to do something like Election Buddy and set that up so that you control who's actually voting, and you don't have people who don't have votes being able to influence the outcome. Does that make any sense, Lynette?
It makes a lot of work for me, but thank you.
I'm afraid it does. Like, the online thing is just a lot harder, but that's why I do believe that you can simplify it by doing voice vote as a show of hands or a poll online, and then just kind of work on that. Often, I think Zoom does have the ability, I'd have to check, where you can put like a thumbs up and a thumbs down. I've seen that in some of the things. I know Teams has it. I can't remember if Zoom has it.
There's actually another question in the chat from Ruth Smith that says, how do you count hand votes in Zoom? On camera or via emoticon or voice vote one by one?
Yeah, I think what you would have to do is basically say, okay, all those voting in favor, put your hands up now, and then you can count the ayes. And then once that's done, say all those voting against, and they put their hands up, and you count the noes. I can't think of anything better than that. But you've just got to be careful, because at district, not every member doesn't necessarily only have one vote. And that's why it only works for a voice vote kind of replacement, because some members will carry multiple votes. You've got an area director who's also a VPE, or and so you just got to be careful that it's not 100% correct. So it only works if there's a big difference. The moment you start getting it quite narrow, then you have to have something like Election Buddy to provide that support.
Thank you.
Okay. I thought there was another hand. No. Cool. Great.
Frank's hand, Keith. Frank's hand was up.
Go for it, Frank.
Well, it was just to illustrate that you can raise your hand and Zoom can tell you what's happening. But another solution, and I suspect that that's what Lynette and Sean are creating, is that after the poll, which is the indicative vote, if it ever becomes closer, Zoom allows you an opportunity to download how everyone on the Zoom participants list has voted, and eliminate those who are not supposed to vote, and then obviously use an Excel spreadsheet that determines how many votes each person has, except the outcome will be slightly delayed. So that's another option.
I think that's it's a great solution, because it is a simpler way of doing it, of actually having the affirmative and the negative, and then appropriating the weightings correctly, because that's effectively what Election Buddy would do anyway. So I think it's good. I mean, my experience with Election Buddy is it's been really tricky in terms of making sure that everybody in the room is registered and everybody gets the thing. So well done, Frank. That's a good one. Cool. So then if we move on to now the tricky part. So once the motion is there on the table, the motion has been placed, there are numerous activities that could happen which kind of disrupt how the flow is going, particularly in the debate. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. Great, thanks. So definitely one of the things is around the order. So we start now looking at our order, and here we're working sort of in reverse order. So the original motion is kind of almost at the bottom of the precedence. Once the motion is on the table, everything that happens kind of takes precedence over it until they're resolved, and then we eventually get back to the motion, hopefully, to deal with. So it's quite important that we start off as the motion as the base, and then we start looking at what changes the flow of discussion until we can actually get back to the motion. So the first thing really is the idea of postpone indefinitely. Now this one's quite a tricky one. It's really interesting that the possibility that someone's tabled a motion and there are people in the room who kind of like, we don't want to discuss this. It is completely inappropriate. It's, if regardless if the motion succeeds or it fails, it's going to have created division. It's controversial. It's problematic. We don't want this discussed at all. So before the debate even starts, so the motion has been proposed, someone can raise their hand and say, I propose that we postpone this indefinitely. It means it's off the table, it's gone. And of course, this obviously has to pass. So the important thing about the postponing indefinitely is that we're dealing with itself is not debated. So if someone says, it is debated, but it's not amendable. So if someone says we want to postpone this immediately, there is an option still to debate. But the whole point is why you're debating why we shouldn't talk about this. And I've been trying to think of a good example. And I know technically districts can't support candidates. Okay, you just can't. But theoretically, let's say there's someone in district or two people in district who are running for higher office. They're running for international positions. And now someone proposes, let's support candidate A. And everyone's like, well, if we say yes, it means that we prefer them to B. And if we say no, it means we prefer B to A. There's no positive outcome in this. It's not worth this. It's not a good discussion to have. And someone will say, well, we're not going to discuss this and proposes a motion. Because it's debatable, that itself could be problematic, because then people start debating why we don't want to discuss this. But it's still something that needs to be put on the table, that maybe there are some things that just not appropriate for district to be discussing, and you want to then clear it out. So that then becomes, it suspends the motion. So the main motion was there, then you have a motion to postpone indefinitely. That then gets debated, then voted on. If it succeeds, then both obviously they disappear. The previous motion is just gone. Okay, but if it doesn't succeed, then obviously you go back to the original motion and you carry on regardless. So it's quite important that it is a tactic or an option that's there, but it's usually only used if it's something that really shouldn't be discussed because it's problematic. The second is our amending. Now, amending in itself becomes quite convoluted and tricky, but theoretically, an amendment, the moment that someone's someone's proposed a motion and you've started the debate, at any point in the debate, someone can actually jump in and say, I propose we amend the original proposal. And amendments generally have to be, the term is used, germane to the motion. So let's say we're talking about the sound equipment. We propose we buy sound equipment. You can't now come and say, and talk about buying a camera and or buying spending money on drinks for everybody at the table. It's kind of not germane to the specific issue being discussed. So when we say that, you kind of there are certain bounds around which you're allowed to amend existing motions. Generally, it's not considered a good idea to negate the motion. So someone says, my motion is to buy sound equipment. And someone says, well, I amended to say we won't buy sound equipment. It's kind of like, well, why don't you just vote down the motion? Because you can't negate something that you're debating. It just doesn't make sense. So you generally consider that is not something that you would allow. But otherwise, a good amendment is inserting words into the motion, or sort of appending words, striking out words. So let's say, for example, we're talking about sound equipment. We say, I propose we buy sound equipment, and someone says that is less than 10,000 Rand as an amendment to kind of like create a boundary condition and can put that in. And then someone else can theoretically go and amend the amendment to say, well, instead of 10,000, let's make it 15,000, because now you're striking out and inserting, you're kind of doing both. And those are all allowed because it's still germane to the point of buying sound equipment. Quite tricky here is that you can amend twice. You can have two outstanding amendments. You can't add a third. So as in my example, the original motion is to buy sound equipment. The amendment is a limit to 10,000 Rand. A second amendment is 15,000 Rand, changing the 10,000 to 15,000. That's still allowed. But someone else can't come and add another amendment and make the 15,000 25,000, because then you just, again, have too many things sitting on the table. Rather resolve the 15, whether that's a yes or a no. Then you could potentially go and change, let's say you accepted the 15, change the 15 to 25. So it's all becomes quite messy. A key thing about amendments is that the amendment is discussed before the passing of the main motion. So when an amendment is there, you spend the time debating the amendment. And it's quite tricky for everyone to kind of think about this process, and because you've got to think about that if the motion passes, do I prefer the original or this amendment? So you've got to, even if you hate the motion and you don't want it to pass, you're spending your time trying to improve the motion that makes it more acceptable, even if you're against it. And so it's quite an important aspect to try and get right. If we can go to the next slide, because I've got to try an example here to kind of see, to make sure that we kind of make sense of this. So let's say the motion is that the national anthem be sung at the start of every meeting. Okay, so that someone has proposed this. That's the main motion. Now, if we go to the next slide, someone then proposes an amendment, and the Sesotho verse would be sung solo by the VPE. That's your first amendment. So now, whether or not you actually want the anthem to be sung at the start of the meeting, you've got to decide this edition of the Sesotho verse being sung solo by the VPE, is that preferable? Do you want to deal with that? Do you want that amendment? Because, and we're not even considering whether or not we want the national anthem to be sung, it's whether or not the amendment improves the motion for us. And then if we go to the next slide, someone else might come with a second amendment, which is that the harmonies be sung by the secretary. So we're getting quite a convoluted motion here, but we're dealing with now, as discussing the second amendment, whether, regardless of whether you want the national anthem to be sung at all, or whether you want the Sesotho verse to be sung by the VPE, it's whether you want the harmonies to be sung by the secretary. And if we jump to the next one, someone could then come along and say, well, actually, I'm making a third amendment. I don't want this to be the secretary, I want it to be the sergeant. Click again. Technically, that's not allowed. As I said, you can only have two running amendments at the same time. So the third amendment is considered unacceptable, and so you can't discuss it. If we carry on, if we go back to our second amendment, now let's assume the second amendment passes. So now the amendment that we are now discussing, we're coming back to the first amendment, has been modified. So the first amendment is, and the Sesotho verse be sung solo by the VPE with the harmony sung by the secretary. Theoretically, at this point, you could now go and introduce an amendment to strike out secretary and talk about the sergeant, because now we're back to only two things being on the table. You can add the third, or the second amendment, but we're not going to go down that complicated route. But now this is the amendment that we're discussing. And then you have the debate still on that amendment, and then there's a vote. And let's say the vote, if we go to the next one, is that we don't like the amendment at all. So even regardless that we've been through all these amendments and we've improved the amendment, we don't like it and it's voted down, the original motion comes back unamended, that the national anthem be sung at the start of every meeting. And let's say that carries, then that's your motion. So it's tricky. It really is a thing for everyone to be aware what it is we're discussing at any particular point in time. So when you're in the amendments, we should not be discussing the merits of the main motion, but the merits of the amendment that we are discussing. I hope that's kind of clear. Are there any questions on that one?
Hi, Keith. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I'm audible.
Yes.
I want to, while you're going through these amendments, if I understand correctly, so it's a main motion that's being discussed. Someone would propose a first amendment. Then it sort of suspends conversation on the main motion, and now we start discussing the first amendment. It would then need to be passed for us to, to go back to a conversation about the main motion. Am I right in saying that?
Yes,
So
correct.
sort of like
Either passed off or voted off. So yeah, but it needs to be resolved, either positively or negatively before you go back to the main motion.
All right, okay. So you would never find yourself in a situation where you are asking the room to pass the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the main motion in a single vote?
Actually, there is, and we're going to get to that. There is an interesting one where, and it's one of the ones we'll get to shortly, but it's called putting the question. I'm trying to get the right phrase for it again, but yeah, the previous question. If someone passes a motion to put the previous question to the vote, and it's that motion is carried, so you can have two amendments. You've got the main motion, First Amendment, Second Amendment, and then someone puts a motion in to say, I want this now, I'm done with this debate, let's vote. They can actually specify whether you vote on the amendment or all the pending questions. So that, that's the one time, Claire, where you kind of, all three things now go to a vote, but you would start with the second amendment. So even if you now decide, right, we're suspending debate, we've had enough, we're now voting, and on all items, you would start with the second amendment vote first, resolve one way or another, and then the first amendment amended if the other one proved, and then the main motion. And all three votes happen sequentially, so that you kind of resolve everything at once. So it is possible. It's not like ideal, but I've seen it happen where council meetings are carrying on for 3 hours, 4 hours, and everyone's just had enough. You're kind of like, well, I think we need to now put this to the vote. The motion itself, and I'll kind of come to that a little bit later, the previous question, the one that closes the debate, is itself has to be carried by 2/3 majority. It's not a simple item. So again, if you put it to a hand vote, or let's say you put it to a voice vote, and it's close, then you carry on the debate. But if it's very clear with a big yes, and like 2 people saying no, sorry for you, it's like, you kind of basically go to the vote. Okay, so it's quite important.
Thanks for that.
Just from a little bit earlier, there was a question from Ruth Smith. It was, how will the district meeting be run in this regard? And I think she was referring to, is it going to be hands up? Is it going to be polls? Do you know that answer?
Yeah, thanks. So I think from what I was recommending earlier, and I think Lynette and myself and Njabula need to have a discussion on this, is that you actually do the first sort of like a hand vote, all the ayes, all the noes, and if there's a big difference, you just carry on. But if there's a small difference, then we do what was suggested that I think it was Frank was suggesting, is that you kind of download those votes, do the number crunching through the spreadsheet, and then you get a proper tally as to how it was carried. So you would actually just do it through one show of hands, and it does make it a little bit easier. Okay. Cool. So then, thanks, Anke. If we could carry on to the next slide. So that was just really talking about amendment. Another one that can sort of suspend, and it can also add to our pile of outstanding discussions, is refer to committee. Now, this is quite a powerful one, and I think it's not used enough, is that often when we're discussing something, we kind of have a sense of the facts, and then maybe someone says, well, from my understanding, this is not the case. The data seems to suggest something else. And everyone's like, well, which is true? Is it that or is it the other? You can always say, let's refer this to a committee. And the important thing about referring to a committee, you can kind of leave it vague, refer to a committee to be set up by the chair, or refer to a committee of these 3 people to report back at this time. And that itself then becomes a motion that we have to debate and resolve. The refer to the committee is itself amendable. So you could actually end up with 2 pending motions plus the refer to committee, which then gets amended itself. But the amendment's important because it might be that you're saying, well, you've listed 3 people. We think we need to add 2 people who are from our sort of minority position. We want to make sure that the committee is looking at all the facts, things like that. That themselves then also subject to another amendment and a vote. So you could end up, and I think this is kind of coming back to our thing of our layers, it's like 3 motions, the main plus 2 amendments, plus a committee, plus a referral to committee, an amendment to the referral to committee, even an amendment to the referral. So yeah, it can get quite messy, but as long as we're all aware of this is what we're discussing, and that's why the secretary, the role for the admin manager and secretary in any other sort of meeting is to keep everyone aware of what we are discussing. So whatever's on the screen, this is what we're debating right now, and these are the things that are still pending, so that you can resolve those things and then get back to the point. But I think referring to a committee is quite useful. I know we kind of used it, I think when we were first talking about Mauritius joining District 5-6 years ago, it was also then, well, let's refer it to a committee. So that we could get more information and come up with a better proposal sort of thing. So it definitely is a useful tool and one to consider when you're in the middle of debate, and information itself becomes uncertain, so that you can go and resolve those things. Then the next one is postpone to a certain time. Now this, it's different to postpone indefinitely. You're not kind of like taking it off the table, but you're saying, look, something's kind of not 100% sure. We want to make sure we get to that first and we'll come back to this. So it might be that we're postponing it to the end of the meeting because something else has to happen first. And it can happen because, let's say you're expecting a guest speaker and they hadn't arrived on time or whatever, so you started with your motions and now the guest speaker arrives. You can postpone till after the guest speaker's speech. And that's a simple one. I think the big thing here is that itself it can be amended because the time can be changed. The whole lot of conditions can be changed, but it's a relatively simple process to consider that the room is ready to move this to another time. And it is a majority decision. So you just kind of, the majority says, right, we want to discuss this, but we'll just discuss it later. So that's also possible. Okay. An important one is limiting or extending the limits of debate. And this, it can be abused, and it's something that you have to be careful of, which is why it actually requires a 2/3 majority. If a debate is about to happen, and it looks like it's going to be a lengthy one, someone in the meeting can say, I move that we only allow 10 speakers to this particular item, or we limit the number of the time to 3 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever it is. It's fine, it's completely valid, but that also has to be voted on. And again, it can be a show of hands, but requires a 2/3 majority because it's limiting the capability for the minority to be able to air their views. And you don't want it to abuse the process so that everyone wants this thing discussed and we're all moving along, but then suddenly someone said, nah, I've had enough, let's limit the discussion. But there are actually a lot of people who still want to speak and they find themselves being kind of shut out. So it's quite important that this in itself it's a 2/3 majority. Okay. And then the last one, the second last one is the previous question. That is the one, as I mentioned, where you can cause us to go to a vote. It does require a 2/3 majority. So you can't just like shut off debate because you've had enough. The majority has to feel they've had enough, and that, or time is running out. We've kind of cycled through this thing a million times. Let's just now get to the vote. So it is something that you can use. It's just something that you've got to be really careful that it isn't an abuse. Interestingly enough, again, a side point, this is something that they use in the Senate in America to stop things coming to a majority decision. It's called, in America, they kind of call it the cloture motion, where you have to have 60 senators say that something can now go to a vote. And often the minority, because they have 49 or maybe even 50 senators, they say, well, sorry for you, but this is not coming to a vote. And so often things never get voted on, and it just kind of sits because they keep it going through this use of this. So it also can be abused by the minority, but it is an important thing that you're not shutting them down at any particular point in time. The last one of these, what we call the subsidiary motions, and it's actually highest on the rank. If you look at your table chart of motions and you go up, it's basically number 6 in terms of the subsidiary motions. It's the highest ranking, and it's called lay on the table. And again, something grossly abused, and it's something you've always got to be careful of, that you want to put something that's being discussed, you just want to put it aside. And again, it could be because, as we said, the guest speaker has arrived or someone's popped up, and you just want, let's just put it aside. We'll come back to it like very soon. You haven't set any timelines or anything, you just put it aside. An interesting thing here, this is an American phrase, lay on the table, and it completely contradicts sort of the English phrase, which we talk tabling a motion. Laying on the table actually means you're taking it off the discussion. It's gone. It's, when you lay something on the table, you're putting it on the table and aside. We'll come back to it later. In our sort of English way of saying it, we would say, I'm tabling a motion means I'm putting it forward for discussion. I'm not taking it away. I'm actually putting it forward. So we're going to be careful here. When we talk about lay on the table, it's taking it off discussion, and all debate just stops. You're just kind of now saying, right, we're putting this aside. And again, this motion is not debatable, and it can be carried by a majority. So it's totally open to abuse. And this, it's one of the things where in Roberts, it allows for it, but there's like a many reasons as to why you shouldn't use it. because it means it's the majority silencing the minority again, where something that kind of needs to be carried just gets shut down and moved off. So again, you should only use it in very specific circumstances, and it basically means, again, if some condition has happened and you want to deal with it, you basically move it on the table and you come back to it later. It doesn't just sit on the table, you have to come back to it later. Okay, any questions on subsidiary motions? Yeah, Kirsten, go for it.
Here's my question is, for every single subsidiary motion, do they need to be seconded?
Mostly they do. If you look on your chart, all of the subsidiary motions require a seconding. Yep. So if someone proposes it, it has to be seconded, and then the debate or the vote. So it's quite nice. The chart of motions gives you a lot of information about it. So for the subsidiary, most of the subsidiaries are debatable. Just looking, so postpone, refer to committee, amend, postpone indefinitely are all debatable. But the lay on the table, previous question, limits the debate are not debatable. So it's quite nice because it kind of gives you a guide, particularly when you're a chair. It's kind of like, oh dear, now what is the key thing? What am I supposed to do next? So, and I think, Kirsten, that's a good one as with every motion almost. And there are a few exceptions here. You require a seconder, particularly for these, just to make sure, again, that you're not going to now get sidetracked by something that's happening in the room because of one person's beef. You've got to kind of make it sure that there is at least, two people who kind of think this is important. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, so again, a lot of this is, as I said, it can get complicated, but the thing is, as long as everyone's aware of where we are, and particularly at a club level, we don't do half as much sort of business sessions or kind of discussion at the club level along these lines. And it would be good, and I'm kind of promoting this a little bit here, is that every quarter, if not every month, you actually have a business session. And most clubs have what we call a on a point or some sort of mechanism at the end for information. Turn that into a business session where the president kind of runs the meeting and then says, well, this is the news, this is the information, this is what I want you to carry. And then other people can raise motions or put things on the table that needs to be discussed. I'm using the phrase wrong again, but basically put things forward for the assembly to be able to discuss. Okay, so yeah, it's just quite an important thing. But once we get into the practice of this, it actually becomes kind of easier to understand where we are because you've got used to it. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, Kirsten. Yeah.
Keith, I was just going to say, if I remember correctly, I stand to be corrected, the president or the district director, they cannot propose themselves, or they can't,
yes.
they can't give a motion themselves.
That's a very good point around chairing. So there are two things about chairing that are quite important. The chair should never propose a motion. Okay, the motions must come from the floor. The chair could say, I will entertain a motion. So let's say everyone, the chair can see that everyone is exhausted. Say, okay, I will entertain, and we're going to talk about this now, a motion to recess for 10 minutes. So the chair can't say, I move that we recess. Technically, that's not a good idea. The chair could say, I will entertain a motion to recess. In other words, hint, hint, if anyone in the room wants to take a break, please raise your hand and propose this motion. And I think, again, that's always the chair's prerogative to say, like, I will entertain because I'm prodding someone in the room to actually do something about this. As chair, I'm not going to. So I think that's also a good one. The other part of good chairing is that you do not participate in the discussion. So if the chair wants a motion passed, generally it's a good idea for the chair to, kind of remove themselves and kind of put someone else in charge, like the second in command, so they can participate in the debate. I know I got really furious when a couple of years ago, the international president chairing a session started actually arguing with people who were against the motion. And I was like, really bad chairing. This just should not be allowed. So Frank is laughing because he knew how furious I was. I was like fuming because I didn't like the motion either. But it was kind of like a bit of haranguing from the chair to kind of silence opposition. And that's exceedingly bad chairing. The chair should, if the chair has an emotional attachment to the discussion, either for or against, you hand over to the second in command and you basically participate, and then that's fine. And then you take over again once that issue is resolved, because otherwise it does lead to very inappropriate behavior for the chair. The chair, there's this whole thing, and I often argue with the lawyers, chairman is supposed to be this kind of idea of manu, where it's supposed to be guiding hand, which I think is not really true. But the idea is that as the chair, you are the guiding hand for what's actually happening in the room. So it's not a dictatorship. It's not about you are telling people which way it's got to go, but you are providing a facilitating role so that the discussions reach a conclusion. So it's quite an important thing. Thanks for bringing that up, Kirsten, because it is good practice for the chair to be as impartial as possible. And if they can't be, to kind of recuse themselves and let someone else chair on that particular item. Okay. Great. So then if we're talking about privileged motions, now here it's an interesting one because the term privilege just carries so many connotations. But the reason here for privilege is to say that these take precedence over the others. Okay, so these are things that can interrupt what is going on. So we've had all these subsidiary motions. We've got the main motion, the subsidiary motion. Now these things can actually interrupt everything and can really change the direction of what's happening. They are not incidental. We'll come to incidental later. Incidental are things that kind of just pop up, but these actually have a very specific purpose, but they are always at the top of the list. The first is call for orders of the day. Again, if you've got an agenda, and the agenda has a flow, after this, something's supposed to happen, then this, then this, then this, and potentially you have times associated with that. Someone can say, and anyone, because if you look on your chart, it is, doesn't require a second. It's not debatable and it's not amendable. It's actually someone saying, whoa, we have strayed from the point. So let's say your agenda item is we are discussing the budget. And yet people are talking about, I don't know, the aircon not working last week, and people are getting completely sidetracked. Anyone can say, I call for orders of the day. We come, and the chair is like, oh, yes, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry, we're coming back to the budget. The chair could say, well, actually, the issue of the aircon is important because of the budget. We're talking about replacing the aircon, then fine. It's kind of germane, and the chair can overrule the orders of the day. But ordinarily, it's for someone to point out that we have strayed from the point. Either we've gone over time, and this has been used in the past. You'll see often now, district does not put times on our agenda because we used to. And then we had in the middle of something really important, and someone says, orders of the day, it's 5 o'clock, and you've actually, oh my word, they write, and you kind of like basically have to adjourn because you've reached the end of it. You didn't extend the time, you didn't do anything properly, and you've now kind of hit a block because you did say the meeting would finish at 5. And so you'll see now often agendas, you don't put times because it puts you into some sort of a bind. But you can still use it if someone like the chair has jumped something. You've got a list of things that are happening and the chair has moved on to the next point. Someone can just say, I call for orders of the day, and chair says, oh yeah, you're right, sorry, we're supposed to have discussed that first. And you go back to the point that should have been discussed. So it's just a useful tool to help, because often as a chair, you will find that you do get sidetracked by other things or something else is happening and you've forgotten a key component, and someone just needs to pull you back to say, well, this is what we're discussing now. Okay. Great question from Devika. Does the chair always have to chair the meeting? Generally, by default, it's the default where the chair is chairing, the president chairs the meeting, and the president also chairs a club meeting ordinarily, but the president can deputize, if they're not available, or as I said, that there's an issue that they want to actually participate in, they can yield the sort of control to the vice president of education or vice president of membership or whatever in some sort of order. But the point is that they do kind of second someone, they deputize them to take over as chair. Okay. Great. Then the other one is the question of privilege. Raising a question of privilege. Now, as I said, this has so many connotations to it, but it's not about that certain people have more privileges than others. That's not the point of a question of privilege. A question of privilege is any member who feels that their privileges as a member are somehow being supplanted, or something's happened, which means that they can't participate the way they would like to. Ordinarily, it could be they can't hear the speaker. So someone, if you sitting in a corner of the room and you can't hear what's going on, you have every right to raise your hand on a question of privilege to say, I can't hear the discussion that's happening on that side of the room. Could you please give them a microphone or do something that kind of gives me the right to participate in this discussion? And every member has that privilege. So it's quite important. We're not, and I know this sort of has been discussed in the past, where some past district governors, directors somehow means that this is a question of privilege for them. It's not. Privilege is for all members who feel that when they want their rights to participate are somehow infringed. And again, it's not something that's debated. It's not something that needs to be seconded. It's just someone saying, look, there's a problem. Can we please fix it? And the chair then has to rules whether they can or they can't. And it might mean, well, I'm sorry, you just have to move closer because there are no mics or whatever. There's got to be some way to resolve it, but it's really up to the chair to do that. The next one is around the recess. As I mentioned, recesses kind of are important. Often you'll find on the agenda something will have already been scheduled, or it might be that it wasn't, and everyone feels that we've gone on long enough, we need to have a break. The recess is different from an adjournment. Okay, so that's why they're kind of there. The recess is just saying we need a break. That's all we're doing. We're not stopping the meeting, whatever, we're just going to go and have a break. So again, technically a recess can be amended. So let's say someone says, I propose a recess of 10 minutes. Someone else can jump up and say, you're kidding. I need a recess of half an hour. I'm going to go and get something strong to drink. So basically the idea is the recess itself can be amended, but it's not something that you debate. Okay, you don't sit there and debate the pros and cons of the recess. It's just, I propose a recess. The chair would just basically look at it and say, well, are there any objections? If no one raises their hand, say, great, we're taking a recess. But as I said, if you've now got, someone says a recess, someone says half an hour, you kind of go, well, firstly, you've got to talk about the half an hour because it's an amendment. So the amendment has to come first. Does anyone have an objection to half an hour? And then you kind of have a vote on the half hour. Then you come back, does anyone have a problem with the recess, whether it's 15 minutes or half an hour is now decided. So I think those are, again, important functions from the position of the chair to listen to the room and allow the room to dictate what's happening, okay? As I did say, and Kirsten was kind of making the point, the chair can't move a recess, but the chair can say, look, and looking around the room, you can see like, half the people are just done with this. Can we have a recess? I'll entertain a motion for recess. Now, adjournment is something else. Adjournment can be quite tricky because adjournment means the end of the meeting. Okay, everything is done. Whatever was on the table is going to have to stay there until the next meeting. You kind of basically shutting down the meeting. It's not recommended you use that often, but generally it's done if we've kind of gone on for long enough and it's late and the chair doesn't want to stop the meeting because there are things still on the agenda. It's kind of, well, someone just says, I call for an adjournment. And the adjournment itself, it's really, again, not debated. You don't start a whole debate as to whether we're adjourning or not. It just actually has to be voted on. It can be, can't be amended. No, it can, sorry, I lied. So, no, it can't. So it basically is an ability for the majority to actually shut down the meeting. And it works from a quite an important parliamentary process, is that nobody should be there if they don't want to be there. We work in an environment where all of these deliberative kind of meetings are there, we're there by choice. And that if people are feeling that this has gone on long enough, they can actually just overrule everything and say, right, we're done, and stop it there and then. So because it's not debated, it's not amended, and it's a majority decision, you've also got to be careful that it's not an abuse, that you're shutting down meetings before you actually get to the juicy bits. Let's take, for example, at a district level, theoretically, it would be disastrous if someone tried to adjourn the meeting before you got to voting in the new cabinet or new committees. So it's one of those things where there has to be a really good reason as to why we're going down this road. But it has been done. And it's, again, there's nothing wrong with it if the room really feels that we're not going down this road. And another one, which is similar, but this one is basically fixing the time to which to adjourn. So it could be that, look, it's coming to the end of the day. Ordinarily, we would only meet again next week. Let's fix a time to which we will come back to deal with the things that we are now stopping tomorrow or before the next meeting. The important thing is adjournment doesn't change the schedule of other meetings that you would have scheduled. It's just creating an additional space to talk about the things that we've run out of time on. And it specifically is done if you're at, like, let's say you're at a convention, a conference, and you've run out of time, and there are other things that we need to get to, like, and I'm going to, like, at a council meeting, if we're at a conference and you get to 1 o'clock and the speech contest starts in 30 minutes, you're kind of like, guys, we are going to adjourn this and we'll come back at 5 o'clock to carry on with the things that need to be done. So we don't stop the whole thing. We're just going to adjourn to another time. That's quite different from an adjournment, which stops the whole thing. You're actually saying we're putting it off and we've set the time. The time itself is up to debate. So you can amend it. So you say, we will adjourn to 5 o'clock, and someone says, let's make it 6 o'clock or whatever, or, sort of whatever, that would be the amendment. But it's an important thing that you can actually adjust, but you're not stopping the discussion. Yeah, Kirsten.
So Keith, my question is, why would you ask to adjourn instead of asking for a recess? Because that's basically what you're doing, is that you are taking a recess. And then my next question, and then I'll stay quiet. What's a lot of meeting agendas have the word close at the end instead of adjourn. So what is the difference with closing a meeting versus adjourning a meeting? But yes.
Yeah. To start with your second question first, adjourning is closing. It's the same thing. Adjourning is just the right way to say, basically, we are done. So the idea of a recess is meant to be just like a short break. We'll kind of go and take a break. We'll come back straight after. Whereas adjourning, saying you kind of like got all these other things happening in between. We're setting up a new time outside our normal schedule to deal with these particular matters. So it's kind of similar, but it has very specific connotations that we are saying we are going to come back. We're not stopping, but we are going to go off and do all these other things. We're going to have the speech contest. We're going to go and take a break, and we'll come back to this. Or you could even say we'll come back to this tomorrow morning, if it's possible. That there's an opportunity to do that. Yeah, Rick.
Morning, Keith. Thanks for the presentation. I'm just looking up the meaning of adjourn on the online dictionaries, because there seems to be some ambiguity here, and the definition they give is to break off a meeting, legal case or game with the intention of resuming it later. So my thought is that the way that they're using it in this chart of adjourn is technically wrong in terms of it should be end or stop, as Kirsten has hinted, rather than adjourn, which does seem to indicate that it's a postponement or a temporary interruption and not the end. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point, Rick, because it is something that I kind of struggle with as well, is this use of the word adjourn. But when you look at the kind of the way it's kind of written, they are saying that basically the process to adjourn is stopping the meeting, but the other one is to kind of come back to a later point, is to keep the stuff on the table. So yeah, I have to agree with you that it's a complicated one. So the motion to adjourn just basically is to close the meeting, but the fix the time to which to adjourn is kind of saying we will come back to this. Yeah, so it's a very interesting use of the phrase, and I would also say that it doesn't sound right, but it is kind of the way it's been written. So, yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks, Rick. Yeah, well done, Frank. Yes. Okay, great. Then if we move on to the next part. And I'm just checking our time. We're still good for an hour. So does anyone want to take a break? Are we good to carry on?
We just had a hand up, I think, for a question. From
Wednesday, sorry.
Yes, Keith. I just wanted to add that maybe in our situation, why adjourn is more used than than close is the regularity of the meetings. That every week, every 2 weeks we meet. That's why we say adjourn.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's a good point.
There's an emphasis, as somebody says there, Frank says in the American English, that it needs to be emphasized. That we're coming back every week, 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I think that's why also the adjournment with fix the time for adjournment actually says you're not going to change the schedule. So your schedule is that we'll be back in 2 weeks, but you might adjourn for a special meeting in a week's time to cover these particular issues. So it's not trying to circumvent the process, but just trying to make sure that you have more opportunity if you've run out of time. But yeah, I get also what Rick's concern is, that how do we use the term sort of interchangeably? Because one definitely has a suggestion we're coming back and the other one doesn't, which is kind of like more that we are done. And it's quite interesting that the same word is used for completely different contexts. Okay, so I see there are a couple of people supporting the motion for the 5 minutes. We're not going to take a vote.
You entertained it.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, if we'll take 5 minutes and we'll be back at 1:15.
Cool.
Thanks.
We can't manage work like this. That's why I use Monday.com. My team uses it to
que você está fazendo? Eu acho que tudo volta ao começo. A gente gosta de mar, de mergulhar em nossas águas. A solidão é ruim quando eu não te tenho. Meu pensamento. O que você quer? Cadê você? Passei na vida esperando teus beijos. Além disso, teus olhos falam de tempo. Mas eu só quero acabar contemplando teu sonho. A lua cheia fica aqui, embaixo nossos pés. Eu preciso de você.
Great. Thanks very much for that break. We're back again. If we can go to the previous slide. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Interesting. I think it took my slow brain to catch up a little bit with what Wenceslas was saying, but he's absolutely 100% on the money there, that the adjournment is a normal end of the meeting because you have something scheduled for the next meeting. So it actually is consistent. So a normal adjournment, which is what you'll get at the end of the meeting, is because we're adjourning to the next scheduled meeting. If someone decides to do a motion to adjourn, it's actually prematurely shutting down the meeting, and then we will just resume to the next meeting in, as Wenceslas was saying, 2 weeks' time, whatever the next scheduled meeting is. But it's also possible then to introduce an adjournment for a fixed time, which is saying we're coming back to what we were discussing differently. So yeah, thanks, Wenceslas. I think it you explained it. It just took my little brain a while to catch up. So yeah, thanks. In terms of, in all of the motions we've spoken about thus far, I think the big thing is that we almost never interrupt a speaker. Someone is speaking, you finish what they had to say before you move on to the next. But there were 2 instances where we allowed for interruption of the speaker and the stuff we've discussed so far. One was raising the question of privilege, because you can't hear them or something's happening, that someone could say, well, I need you to look at me now and deal with my problem, even though someone else is busy speaking. And the other was calling for orders of the day. And particularly if someone is talking for half an hour over there about the aircon, you want to kind of like, hang on, can we get back to the point, please? So we can move on with the agenda. Those are the only 2 times in the stuff that we've discussed up till now that you're allowed to interrupt. Quite a few of these incidental motions carry an interruption. Now, the first one is the point of order. Now, of course, anyone in this country, in South Africa, who has watched any of the presidential addresses over the last 10 years would have seen this being abused horribly on a number of occasions. Endless points of order, more to embarrass the speaker than anything else. There is a validity to a point of order, and that is really to kind of bring up something that's really important that is kind of needs to be corrected. And specifically, if we're dealing with some rules are somehow being flouted. And it's kind of like, point of order, this shouldn't be happening now, or point of order, you forgot to, we've got a second speaker who's talking for, you forgot about someone to speak against. Or trying to get us back to what should we be doing now? It's not about listen to me now because I've got the biggest voice and I'm going to carry on doing points of orders just to disrupt. There's a validity to a point of order, but it can be abused. And the chair can actually decide whether the order is upheld or not. Okay. The only time, if the chair says, let's say you've got a point of order and the chair rules against you, there is only the, well, I'm trying to find the right one now again, but there's an ability to appeal the chair. Where is appeal the chair? Oh, there it is. It's the next one, sorry. To appeal the chair's ruling. So if you've said, well, you know, we've had 2 4s and I'm against, why are we having 2 4s? I've made a point of order, and the chair just says, well, sorry, you didn't raise your hand fast enough. I went with him anyway. And they go, well, hang on, I'm appealing this. Now, appealing is a little bit more complicated, but with the appeal, you effectively, it has to be seconded. So you've got an issue, and the chair's like, well, it's not an issue. Then someone else can say, well, actually, no, I second this, you appeal, and someone else has to second that. And then you can actually have a nice little discussion about the overriding the chair, and then you vote as to whether the chair did or didn't follow the right thing. So the chair can be overruled if they've done something wrong, but ordinarily it's kind of like you talk to the chair and the chair realizes, oh yeah, I was wrong, and fix it. So in my case of the errant international president, theoretically, we should have been able to actually appeal the decisions of the chair and say, well, you need to move yourself aside. And if anyone else agreed, you would actually have to debate that and deal with it. That the chair needs to relinquish control so that they can actually participate in the debate. That's a theoretical thing that you could do, because as a point of order, they should not have been participating in the debate. And if they chose not to move aside, then you can do an appeal to force them to move aside. And again, it's this principle that fairness must be seen to happen. And if the chair's being autocratic or making decisions that are wrong, you always have that opportunity to override. And all of this would effectively suspend what is actually already happening in the room, so that you're kind of dealing with points of orders and appeals and stuff. So they're incidental, but they're quite important because they deal with issues if someone's kind of not being treated correctly. Okay, then the next one is sort of a request or a point of information. It's like a point of order, but point of orders are about parliamentary procedure. That the point of order is that you're not following the rules in terms of the debate. A request for information or a point of information is throwing a question. So let's say, for example, you're debating the budget, and someone then says, well, hang on, request for information. I didn't see an item about X, and you're asking for more information. The speaker then can go and find the information and provide it. It's not meant to disrupt the flow, but if it's a relatively important bit and there's information that is required, you can use this to do it. And again, it's not something that's debated. It's really up to the chair to make sure that they can meet those requests. The fourth one is suspending the rules. And again, a tricky one. You've always got to be very careful about this. And it's more about, is there something that needs to be debated which somehow the rules don't allow? And here I take, for example, we have the code of practice. I mentioned the code of practice for district. And the code of practice says that when you've got a motion on the table, it's 3 minutes for the proposer, 2 minutes for everyone else through the discussion. It might be that someone said, but hang on, 2 minutes is not long enough for us to be able to say what we need to say. I move that we suspend the rules that we can have 4 minutes to discuss or whatever. And that would then mean that the rules that we have established, we will put aside for the duration of that discussion to accommodate that we have a better discussion on the issue. It may well be voted down because, I mean, who wants to sit and listen to 5-minute speeches backwards and forwards? But the point is you have that opportunity to suspend the rules. It's also possible to change an agenda. So if, like in the agenda, something else was meant to happen, you can suspend that and move it. But this is why this particular one, in terms of suspension of the rules, it's a 2/3 majority. And so again, because you're changing the course of the flow that had been preset. And it's something we haven't really discussed, but agendas are quite important. Agendas set a flow, and you send out the agendas before the meeting so that everyone knows what's on the agenda. Anytime you want to change an agenda or insert things that weren't there or whatever, you need 2/3, because people may have chosen not to come because they saw nothing controversial on the agenda, so they didn't pitch up for the meeting, and now you've gone and thrown in a real curveball. it's just not appropriate unless you've got 2/3 of the people in the room saying, yeah, no, we're fine with this. We can accommodate this because it's not, it's within our power to do so. But it is important that anything that changes the agenda, suspends the rules, does require a 2/3 majority. Then we come to another one, which is the objection to consideration of the question. It's a little bit like what we talked about earlier with the indefinite what did I call it? Indefinite moving of the, sorry, my cat's sitting on my notes, as indefinite postponement of a discussion. But this is where you have a serious objection. And it basically also is a 2/3 majority, but it needs to happen before the debate has started. And what it could be, let's say again, it's that the objection is that you actually don't have the mandate to discuss this. You've put something on the agenda, someone's gone and looked at it and said, but hang on, we can't make this decision. And then you object to it. If the 2/3 majority says yes, then it's gone. Again, so it's something that you can use to suspend. It could also be that it's, if carried, this would, well, if debated even, this would create some embarrassment for someone. And you want to kind of like kill that off before it happens. Without raising all sorts of issues. I mean, decades, a long time ago, we had a debate to censure someone, okay? And that, it created a lot of problems. There's a lot of animosity, a lot of backwards and forwards. That could have been avoided if there was an objection to consider the censure and 2/3 majority said, yeah, this is completely out. It would have been done and dusted and it would just be gone. But we didn't, again, in our defense, sometimes we just didn't know all the parliamentary rules of things that you could use. If we had known at the time, I think we could have killed it a lot earlier and have avoided a lot of pain and suffering for the person involved. And it's just one of those things where you always have to be careful that you can use it, and it's a good thing to use, but it can also be abused. So it's just something to consider as an option. If something is just so reprehensible that we shouldn't go into it, you can use this as an opportunity. And because it itself is not debatable, it's actually relatively good to kind of get it done and dusted and out of the way. One I quite like is this idea of the division of a question. And it's something we probably should use more often than we do. When you have a debate on a motion, and the motion has multiple parts, is an idea to kind of break those into the parts that are worthy of discussion. So let's say, for example, you're talking about we will have the next conference at such a date and at such a place. And you kind of, the debate is bouncing around between the two. Some people are debating the time, some people are debating the place. You kind of, let's split that up. Let's debate the place first. So you divide the question, we will debate where it's going to be held. And the second thing, we can debate the time. A good example would have been also, I think it was not last council meeting, or the one before, was the discussion about the restructuring, what did we call it, the alignment, where there was a debate about the alignment and a debate about the lettering of the alignment. There might have been an idea to split it, so that you kind of, let's talk about the structure, are we okay with the structure? But then let's talk about these letters and how they get aligned. So it's possible to split a thing if one can be considered independently of the other. Very similar is the consideration by paragraph seriatim. And it's where you might have a report that has various components and you want to consider the report separately and you want to deal with the chapters individually, or you have a complicated resolution. In Toastmasters, we don't have that a lot, but it can be done. We generally tend to try and break up resolutions into the smallest parts possible, but it is possible that someone's put a proposal together and the components could be considered independently. You do that, and then once each of them is approved, then you come back to the whole. I know in the business world we would get this a lot, and this is why parliamentary practice is quite useful, not only for us as Toastmasters, but how we do this in deliberative committees that we're involved with in the workplace. So let's say, for example, there's a resolution, and often at board meetings and subcommittee meetings and stuff, there are always resolutions, and people put together these like page-long resolutions that the committee now has to approve. It might be worthwhile to break those up into paragraphs and say, yes, that we don't have a problem with. This we want to fix. This says X, Y, and Z. Let's spend time fixing that and dealing with each individually. But even though you've approved all of the subcomponents, it doesn't mean that it's carried. You've got to then come back. Once you've amended sufficiently, you've done all the things you needed to do, you come back with the whole, you still have to approve the whole. Okay, so even though you've approved all the amendments along the way, it's still not passed until the whole thing has come back to the table. So that's quite an important one. And I think it's a great way to kind of break up more complex issues to actually go through it in that environment. Obviously, at a council meeting, it's a little bit complicated for 100, 150, 200 people to be going through this thing in such detail. But if you've got smaller committees and you have those sort of reports, it's not a bad idea to consider this. Okay. Then the division of the assembly, and this is the one I mentioned before. Anyone in the meeting can say, when a vote is taking place, I want a division of the assembly. It's not the same as calling the question. Calling the question is closing debate and having the votes. This is saying, I want the vote to be recorded by show of hands, and it's not just a voice vote. So that's quite an important one. It's just someone saying, as a member, I have that right. I need to know that this has been carried or not carried and very clearly by the show of hands. Okay, so that's quite a useful one as well. So it's different from division of the question, which is breaking down the motion to its component parts, and division of the assembly is just making sure that in the days of Parliament, division of the House basically meant people lined up for and against, and you could now count them all. And it's kind of essentially what you're doing here. You're just saying division of the assembly, so we can see the ayes and the noes, and we can move on from that. Great. Any questions on incidental motions? Cool. Just checking time. We're still good. Great. Then if we can go to the next slide, please. So the issue here is quite tricky ones about reconsidering and rescinding previous decisions. Okay. So often it's not a good idea when decisions have been made that you have a tendency to revisit those decisions. It's, the decision is a decision and it stands, but there will be a time when you might need to reconsider. And ordinarily for reconsidering, there are a couple of rules that kind of go with it. The first thing, the action, so let's say district will buy a printer. You can't reconsider that once you bought the printer. It's kind of like it's done and dusted. So if there's an action that comes out of the decision, it can't be reconsidered. You have to now deal with the consequences of that decision, but reconsidering is not what it's about. But if you still have time, and if there's a very short passage of time, again, it shouldn't have been like a decision was made a year ago, and then a year later, let's reconsider that decision. It's a different thing. You can now do a new motion that maybe reverses previous decisions, but it's different from reconsider. Reconsider is also if the person who voted, it has to be brought up by someone who voted for or debated in favor of the motion. And it can happen where more information has come to light. So let's say the committee decided on something, but then suddenly a couple of hours, you get a new message that actually the basis on which you made that decision was wrong. Then the person one of the people who voted for, or one of the proponents even, could come back and say, we need to reconsider this. We made a mistake. That is a very specific kind of motion, because now you're saying that things have changed. We need to look at this again. But it's not that the people who lost are waiting for an opportunity for the majority from the other side to not be present and to reconsider the motion. Okay. Which again is the risk that could be the thing, but that's why the rule for reconsidering is that it has to be someone who voted for, who's actually now changed their minds based on some information. Okay, and it should be basically at the same meeting if possible. It needs to, otherwise, you've basically got a problem where you call a new meeting, you don't send out an agenda or whatever, or you kind of just make sure that it's inconvenient for a lot of other people, and then you reconsider something that you disagreed with. It's generally got to be at the same meeting, maybe a bit later, you've got the better information, and you go and you fix it. Okay. Then the rescind is actually quite interesting because a rescind is to kind of basically reverse the previous decision. And it needs 2/3 of approval, particularly if there was no agenda that was sent out. So normally what would, and again, it's because of the same thing that you're rescinding something because you're waiting for the majority that were there previously to somehow be otherwise occupied, that you can now go and rescind their decision. It's got to be something where the agenda has gone out. This item is very clear to everyone. There's a notice that we are going to talk about this motion. And it's quite possible that, let's say at the first meeting, you had a very low, you had a quorum, but it was a low turnout and a decision was made. People like look at this as like, well, yeah, we're not sure. Let's see if we get more people at the meeting, we can maybe look at rescinding. And then you get 100% turnout, larger group, and you can put it on the table again. It's the same as sort of reconsidering or rescinding. But the idea is that whatever the decision is made is now gone. You've taken that off the table. But again, there are rules around it because it's open to abuse, and you've got to be very careful that it's not about two parties in the assembly always just waiting for the other one to not be available. And kind of, so, and you're bouncing backwards and forwards between decisions and everyone's left kind of hanging. So just to recap before we go, yeah, Kirsten?
Okay. Sorry, Keith. So my question is, I don't know if you remember, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, International made a lot of grammar corrections to our governing documents and that type of thing. Now, if could we go back now and say to them, you need to reconsider that, or would it be a new motion? So
yeah, I think it would have to be a new motion because again, time has passed and the changes have been implemented.
Okay. So the changes. Okay. So that was my question, because I was thinking about all of our governing documents and our club charters and all of that. We make changes through those business meetings every year. Are we reconsidering, or are we proposing new motions?
You're proposing new motions because you've implemented the changes.
Okay, thank you.
So the reconsider has to happen before action takes place on that particular decision. So it could be, let's say, you are sending the president and the VPE to district council, and you're going to pay their money. And the motion is carried. And then suddenly the treasurer said, oh, we just don't have the money for this because the treasurer wasn't at the meeting. So at the next possible opportunity, which would probably be the next meeting, you've got to say, well, guys, you've got to reconsider this. We don't have the money. And again, it's new information that's come to light. So you're changing a decision. But again, the people who voted for it have to propose it. So it's kind of so it's not, the people who are against now saying, see, we told you there was no money. It's got to be the people who said, well, yeah, we're okay with this. But now more information has come to light. Okay, we need to look at this. We don't have the money. So there are set kind of rules. Alternatively, it's always possible that someone could come and say, well, the action hasn't happened yet. Or once the action has happened, you can say, well, we shouldn't have made that decision, but it's too late. You can't go and change it. But what you could do is say, we're not sending the next president and VPE, or we're not sending them to the next conference unless we have the money. So make some sort of amendment. But once the action's taken place, you can't reconsider. Okay. So some of the things are just kind of some special notes, and I think we did discuss this as Kirsten pointed out. The chair should not be participating in the debate or proposing motions. That's quite an important one. Ordinarily in a motion, and you have seen the way I've tried to explain motions, a motion has to be either a yes or a no. A motion can't be a choice of 3 things. You can't say, well, we propose A, B, and C, that for holiday or for our next conference, it will be in Cape Town, Johannesburg, or Limpopo, or Polokwane. Those are your 3 options. It's either got to be, our option is to go to Cape Town or not. And someone then can amend and say, okay, no, we want to go to Joburg and then discuss that one. And someone can amend that and say, no, we want to go to Polokwane and discuss that one. But it's either a yes or a no. And so it becomes problematic because sometimes people do put motions. So they say, we have 3 cases, choose one of them. And it becomes problematic. So the rule is that a plurality can never carry a motion. So a plurality is a very specific kind of thing where it's the highest number of votes, but it's not a 50% plus one. So if you're somewhere in between, you've got three options, A, B, and C, and A gets the most votes, but B and C together have got more votes. That's not, the motion is not valid. You can't say you've carried the motion. Basically, you would have to drop off one of the others so that then it becomes a choice of A or B or A or C. And so it's quite important that motions should not be written so that you have multiple choices and then the highest one just wins and we move on. It's considered very bad practice. Often you might find that if, let's say we've got a council meeting and you've got 250 people in the room and they're all registered, but only 120 vote, is it still valid? And the Robert says, absolutely. You know, if the other 130 just don't care, or they kind of were switched off, or they weren't paying attention, you know, theoretically it's people in the room, so you would always have this thing of quorum. One of the rules of order, so we didn't talk about that, if you do a point of order, there's a point of order to verify that you still have a quorum. So if there's a sense that somehow everybody registered for the room, well, great, but then like you ask a question and there's hardly anybody there, you kind of go, are we quorate? And they kind of then have to do a whole process to make sure that everybody's in the room. And of course, when you're face to face, it's easy. You can look around and yeah, okay, everyone's here. But if it's online, it is a little bit trickier, and I don't want to go down how you would accomplish that. But the point being is that even if everyone's in the room and 130 people are like, no, I just don't care, I can't make up my mind, the majority of the 120 still counts. Okay, so even if 70 for and 50 against and 130 don't care, the 70 carry it. Okay, it's the same as elections. You know, it's the people who rock up and vote carry the vote. The people who couldn't be bothered don't get to say yay or nay, because it was too much of a stress to actually get out and vote. So the point being is that the people who rock up make the decision, even if it's not the majority of the people present. It's still the majority of the decision. We often have this question about spoiled ballots. Okay, so ordinarily in a yes or no situation, you don't really have a problem of spoiled ballots. In elections, you do, but even then, in most of the cases, if something's spoiled, it just doesn't count. It's valid votes are the things that count. So the majority of the valid votes is essentially what carries the item. No one can be required to vote. So again, if you've got 250 people in the room and only 130 vote or 120 vote, you can't force the other 130 who kind of don't really know where they're going to make a decision on this. You can't make them kind of, you will vote. You know, this isn't Australia where we kind of force people to vote on a regular basis. It's kind of, you're supposed to, part of your democratic decision is not to vote. And so that's, again, applies in the room as well. Okay. Pretty much those are the
Keith,
yeah.
Keith, so what you're saying is the quorum has to be in the room, but the quorum does not have to be participative.
Yep, exactly. No one can make people vote. Like, yeah.
And an abstention, a majority abstention would never ever be the result.
Well, so you can still have the majority not participating, but the decision is then made by those that participate.
Minority, yeah. So,
yeah.
But it could never ever be. So we couldn't say the majority abstained from this vote, so we're not going to pass it. You can't say that.
You can't say that. So as long as you, and I think Anton's asking the question there, is like, how do you count the nays? Yes, so you always have to have a yes and a no. So if, let's say we've got a question and we've got show of hands, let's say we're all in the room just to make it simpler. And so you say all the yeses and you count the yeses and there are 70 yeses. And all the no's, you count the no's and there are 50. And you kind of look at that, well, that's only 120, but we know there are 250 votes available. It doesn't matter. The majority of those who participated, the yes and the no's, the majority wins. So if the yeses were 60 and the no's were 80, and there's a whole lot that's not counted because they didn't participate, the no's carry it. So it's quite an important aspect from that side. The one thing I didn't talk about was chairing and voting. Generally, it's not considered a good idea for the chair to exercise a vote in a decision, particularly a yes or a no. unless the chair could change the decision. Okay, so it's kind of like almost in the Senate, where you have the vice president has a casting vote. So if you've got a 50-50 decision and the chair's vote could change it, they have the right to vote. But if it's a 52-48 decision and the chair's vote wouldn't change it, then they don't vote. They just leave it alone. But only once they actually can change the vote, they have the right to still vote as a member. But otherwise, it's a good idea for the chair not to say yes or no. It's not counted. Okay, so that's also quite an interesting one about the chairs. So what I'd like to do is, in the last little bit of time, we can do questions, but I've got a couple of examples and we can maybe talk around the examples. So I'm afraid you're going to have to do a little bit of clever work there to kind of show. So one of the big things, if you go back up. So yeah, one more. So let's say we go back to our previous example where we were talking about the national anthem and the First Amendment is being discussed, whether or not this, and it's been modified with the harmonies by the secretary. Now, someone pops up with a proposal and it's one of the subsidiary things. So if you can click, please. And it's kind of referred to the committee. And someone says, well, we don't know that the secretary can actually sing harmonies. Let's have a committee. Let's have a discussion to see how many of the secretaries in the room can actually sing the harmonies, because it's an important bit of information and we need to refer to the committee. So someone has proposed that, and now you start debating the referral to the committee. It's possible, theoretically, for someone else to throw in another motion, if you can click again, to lay the whole lot on the table. It's like someone else says, like, this is just getting ridiculous. I really don't care. Let's just lay this on the table. Or guess what? It's lunchtime. I'm tired of this discussion. Let's lay it on the table. We can come back to it. So again, if you use it correctly, we're not kind of killing the discussion. We'll just come back to it later. And again, that itself, the laying on the table, you don't debate it, but you kind of have to vote then that we're going to now move on. So in this example, there are 4 pending issues. So if you do lay it on the table and it's agreed, you would have to come back to the refer to the committee, because that's the last pending issue that wasn't resolved. Okay, so all of these things you've got to keep, like almost like this little track that I'm trying to do there to show that this is still pending. There's still a main motion, there's still a First Amendment, there's still a referral to committee, but we are now discussing the laying on the table, or we're voting on the laying on the table. Okay, if the lay on the table fails, now you just go back to referring to committee, and then you resolve that. Then you can go back to the First Amendment and the main amendment. The referral to the committee, theoretically, could also, you refer the whole thing, the main motion, the First Amendment, everything to the committee. You can't refer a subclause, because then you can't actually resolve the main motion. So when you refer to committee, all the pending stuff now goes off, and you're going to go and the committee can go and deliberate how well the VPE and the secretary can actually sing or whatever. So, yeah. Okay. Right, if we go to the next one. So here again, if we go to the same one, the idea is that we have a point of information. If someone pops up and says, well, there's a point of information, I've heard the secretary sing and it's a disaster. Can we, I'd like us to think about that. And then someone pops up with a question of privilege. All of these interrupt the flow, but they don't change. There's no pending item that changes. The question of privilege is that you're kind of pointing out that I missed that previous couple of points about the secretary singing. Can we please repeat that? It's just really, I can't hear, I need to know more information, or something distracted me outside. There were people running around naked. Can we please sort of come back to the point, I missed some of that, okay? Then the last one is then you now can actually, someone can raise the previous question. And as we mentioned before, the previous question is not itself debatable, it's not amendable. It does require a second, but it does mean that you've got to vote on it. So after all this discussion on the amendment, someone can say, I raised the previous question, or I call for a close of debate, same thing. You basically then say, okay, let's vote. And if that's carried, then you do this process, as I mentioned, so the previous question says, right, we've closed the debate. Now you've got to look at the First Amendment. Is the First Amendment approved or not? Depending on that, you then go back to the main motion. Either it's amended or it's not amended, and you vote on that. And it's all resolved in one go. Okay, so it kind of puts a rather dramatic end to the whole process by having this previous question called. Okay, Theoretically, you can do the previous question only on the amendment, because you think this debate is just kind of, let's just resolve this. And it allows that the previous question for the amendment is covered, then you could carry on debate on the main motion. That's also an option. So the person who's raising the previous question just says, I would like all pending issues to, voted on, or I would just like a vote on this particular amendment. Okay, great. And I think that's pretty much it, unless there are particular questions, if anyone has any outstanding questions. Cool. Hopefully we didn't flabbergast you so much with all the convolution. And again, just look for the chart of motions. It's quite useful, particularly when you're chairing a meeting. I love to have this around because sometimes I get lost as to what's happening next and who can or can't do this. I think it's really lovely because it also shows you whether or not something's debatable, whether it needs to be seconded, whether it can interrupt a speaker. It provides quite a nice, neat thing so that you can always come back to this as a way. And particularly as a council chair for our district director, for anyone as a president, it's very useful to have it in front of you as well. So that you don't get lost in the process.
While we wait for some questions, there's 2 slides after your questions slide. Do you want to go through them, the meeting agenda?
Oh, we can if we want to, unless someone has any other questions, we can just talk about them quickly, because it's just really about how you set up agendas and minutes, but we can have a quick look at those. Those are sort of my backup if we had lots of time, but it's just really kind of how we would do agendas. Really importantly, making sure we have the date, time, and venue, because the thing about an agenda, as I was trying to point out beforehand, it sets the parameters of what's going to be discussed on the day, and you need to provide everyone the opportunity to participate. So all the members need to get the agenda. They need to know when it's going to be held, and when and where. And then it's kind of just the ordinary thing is always like call to order, welcome, introductions, apologies, the approval of the agenda. So the approval of the agenda is where people have an opportunity to amend the agenda. And as I said, all those sort of amendments take 2/3 majority, because the thing's gone out. Anytime you want to change it, you've got to make sure that the vast majority are able to amend. And then, oh, sorry, Anke. Then the minutes, matters arising from the minutes. This is an interesting one about the reports, because I've seen different districts do things slightly differently. My belief, and I've seen it in other places, is that the report should come very early on, because the reports are the office bearers telling people what's going on and giving an opportunity to provide the information. Only then do you elect. I've seen it quite a few districts where the election takes place before the reports, because some of the candidates for the election are officers, and they feel that it's unfair to give them that advantage to give a report back before the election. The rules on elections don't require that. You know, people who are officers always have a right, and it's kind of, maybe it's a benefit for incumbents, and maybe that's why people do it that way. But for people who have done the work for the previous year, they get to actually report on the work that they've done, even if it gives them an unfair advantage. So I have seen it done, but I just think it's unnecessary to kind of do this convoluted thing to pretend that someone who's running for office wasn't the previous club growth director or program quality director or division director. It just kind of, it doesn't make sense, but I've just seen it done. So that's also a choice that districts make. And I believe that the reporting is an important thing, and always by shoving it to the end, you're kind of like making it unimportant. So yeah, unfinished business is usually where there is stuff that has been not resolved at previous meetings. So particularly if you've got things that were laid on the table, or if there was an adjournment or something, there may well be things that are unfinished. And especially if you did do an adjournment to a set time, that is definitely unfinished business that you need to now resolve. And then new business are new motions that we would have to resolve, and then closure or adjournment, however you want to call it.
Keith?
Okay, so, yeah.
So what's the difference between unfinished business and matters arising?
So matters arising are things that were in the previous minutes. So let's say you had an action, and usually we're dealing with things that are action resolved. So it's not that a motion was never resolved. There was a resolution, but there required some feedback. So let's say that the decision was district will buy a printer. So now the matters arising is whoever was meant to do that coming back and saying, yes, we have bought the printer, or it's still outstanding or something. So matters arising are very relate to actions really from the previous meeting. Unfinished business is decisions that were never resolved. And so that's why they're quite different. Okay. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and just quickly get to them. Roberts, or if the chart is available in French. Good question, Ruth. We can check on the TI website. You might be able to find the chart of motions. I've only seen it in English, but I'm pretty sure a lot of the Toastmasters material is available in French, so we can see whether it is. It's an interesting one whether Roberts has been translated. I'm pretty sure it must have been. So Roberts is available. If you go to Amazon or any of those, you'll be able to download it or even order it through a bookshop. And I'm pretty sure you'll come across a French version. I'd be very surprised if it isn't. But it's something that you would have to just check with your local bookshop and check. In terms of the presentation, absolutely we can share. I'll just check with Anka that she'll has everyone's details to be able to send it to. Okay, sorry, and just the last one. Good highlight on resolutions. Okay, so resolutions, Devika, are pretty much the same as motion, because a resolution is the motion. So what you can do is that when an agenda is sent out to a meeting, as Lynette would have done with the agenda for the district council meeting, say, please send me any motions you would like discussed. Technically, motions are always allowed up until we get to new business. So anyone can come up with a motion on the day. There's nothing that precludes anyone from doing that. It just helps if we know about the motion beforehand, we can influence in terms of, particularly as a parliamentarian, I can say, well, that wording is problematic, or that's actually out of order. I see Devika's got a copy of Robert's Rules of Order. Okay, thanks. And I've done it before, where someone asks something as a motion, which district actually can't do. And so I contact them and say, well, we can't actually have this motion because we don't have the power to do these things. So it's quite useful that people provide that information upfront so we can resolve it. But on the day, in the meeting, before you get to new business, anyone can submit a motion. So it's best to be done through the secretary. And so kind of the secretary's email address, if it's online, or in the room, people just bring you a sheet of paper with their motion signed and that sort of thing. And it's important that usually you put who's proposing and who's seconding, just to know that there are at least two people behind this, and it's not just a one-person affair. Okay. Cool. So that's pretty much it from my side. Yep. If there are any questions, please drop me a note. My email address is bowenkt@gmail.com. Feel free to drop me any questions around running the sessions, if you have anything else for parliamentary procedure. But otherwise, hopefully we'll see you all at the next session, at the council meeting on Saturday.